Welcome, everybody. It's really great to be here. We got a good crowd. Before I get started, obviously, you know what you're here to see, so I want to learn something about you. So, who uses Tomcat? As expected, pretty much everybody in the room. Who also uses another app server like JBoss or Glassfish? Also, very, very large percentage of the room. That'd be about 3/4, if not more. And that's, you know, as I say, that's really what we're trying to do with TomEE, at least at minimum. You typically get as far as you can with Tomcat, and then you run into some limitations, and then you have to use another server because it just gets too hard to integrate all the stuff together. Brave question: who's used TomEE before or tried it out? Hey, good number of hands. Yeah, we're kind of new to the whole JavaEE scene, and so it's nice to see some hands go up. Who saw my talk last year by chance? Okay, good. So I guess it's all going to be fresh, new material. You never know what to repeat or what not to repeat. I think one way to summarize kind of how we got to where we are is this kind of phrase. I met somebody named Michael in the lobby yesterday, and he said something that very accurately summarized the last 10 years of my life, which was good decisions come from experience, and experience come from bad decisions. So having been in JavaEE for like a really long time and done things in a way that you're sort of trying to tell people what they want and what they should use and what they should do, we decided to take the opposite approach and say, all right, let's stop. Let's figure out what people are actually doing, and let's just try and help them. Let's just try and make that better. And so when we created TomEE, the goal was not to make yet another choice for the sake of having just another choice. The goal was very specifically that almost everybody uses Tomcat for something, want to use Tomcat for more, and almost everybody spends a significant amount of time putting all this stuff in the box because that's better than whatever alternative that they offer. And so we wanted to say, all right, that's a great way to do things, that's valid. Let's take that and integrate it further. Just take it a little bit farther so you don't have to start from here and go up to there every single time you start on a new project. The interesting thing is, I don't know anybody's Tomcat integrations that are all these custom Tomcat integrations that are exactly the same. So if you are in one job and you're using a Tomcat stack, you go into another job and you have to learn how they decided to integrate all that stuff together. And so that whole easy portability stuff is not quite as great as it could be. So we're lifting it up, putting it in the same realm as a certified server, not because JavaEE is the best thing in the world, which I think it is great, but because it's ultimately easier for the people who have to consume it. So thank you, Michael, if you're in the audience. I believe, okay. So question about JavaEE. So this is kind of when I'm talking with someone, they say J2EE, I go, okay, there's some things we need to talk about. So what may have happened in JavaEE since the days of J2EE? So high-level recap of some game changers. This is not the entirety of it, but basically it's not called J2EE, it's called JavaEE. So if you're still talking about Constantinople, understand that it's now Istanbul. If you're talking about the history of your life in Constantinople, it's a little bit different now. So another one is the web profile. So the web profile is half the full profile. So Corba, JAXRS, lots of legacy technologies are not in the web profile. The web profile was giving an inch. That's what JavaEE decided to do. Okay, it said the world's saying that this stuff is heavy, and in a lot of ways that they're correct. So rather than fight that, we're going to trim down and create a new, smaller, just containing the greatest hits of JavaEE and offer that to people and allow vendors to certify that, and then that's your new base. If you want to go all the way up to a full profile server, there are plenty of them out there. You can go ahead and do that, but you can have a guaranteed level of portability at the web profile layer, and that opens up more options for things like TomEE to exist. When that was created, it was sort of manifest destiny. I mean, we had been working on some very similar pieces to what is TomEE. But when the web profile was being discussed, it was like, wow, okay, we don't need to do all these complicated things that we would normally have to do to become a JavaEE server. I'm one of the founders of Geronimo, and so I had to work on terrible things that probably no one here has ever used, such as, I hope no one's ever used, JAXRS. Yeah, it's really, really, really bad. You know, CMP entity beans. Is anyone? Yeah. Okay. You guys who raised your hand, you're awesome for still being here. So these are some certain things that are not, you know, the JavaEE took it on the chin over, and they're cut out of the web profile. They're not there in the web profile. Another one is ear files are dead. So, I mean, they're still there, but ultimately, the WAR file is where it's at these days. You can put everything in the WAR file. It used to be that JavaEE would be like, you know what, for your own good, we're going to say that you have to split up all your jars into all these modules, and we're going to mandate a certain class loader structure, so all your EJBs are here, and your third-party libraries and your web apps are here, and they don't see each other, and we're going to package it all together. So you have a jar within a jar within a jar, and then it's a little Russian doll thing. I mean, it's impossible to do that because you go ahead and throw a third-party library in your WAR file, and then you decide, oh, I want my EJB to use it, but my EJB can't see the stuff in the WAR. And so now, since you needed one EJB, you had to go from a WAR file to this huge complexity, and that's just a big moment of, you know, Fonzie jumping the shark. That's when you decide, let's do something else. And that's dead. You can put everything in the WAR file now. Everyone knows how to build a WAR file. All the tooling for WAR files work great. The tooling for ears often doesn't work so wonderfully. Maven's ear support is written by people who don't use it. So it's ultimately not that great. JavaEE is now testable. So despite the fact that you can't do this and you can't do that, yes, you can in fact do this. There are two great choices for that. One, in EE6, we added the concept of embeddable containers. So JavaSE, SE running EJB container, and you could do that very easily with servlets via Jetty and things like that in the past. JPA's runnable in SE environment. You could run almost the entire stack standardly in an SE environment. Non-standardly, you can run the entire stack in an SE environment. Everybody now has an embedded container. So in JavaEE 6, we added the requirement for an embeddable EJB container, and that didn't cover standardly the entire specification, but it covered the part that was perceived as the hardest. And so when all the vendors had to take their EJB container and make it an embeddable container per requirement of the specification, they figured, well, as long as we're doing it, let's just go all the way. So most people have a fully embeddable container, Glassfish, JBoss, of course, TomEE. It's the way things are going these days, and I really hope that that continues. We were really a core part of that. TomEE comes from the project OpenEJB, which was trying to be an embeddable container years ago, and that was not the way things were being perceived back then. So it was a good idea at the wrong time, which is tantamount to a bad idea. And that goes back to the whole, knowing what not to do thing. And so we amongst others have been championing that embedded container concept. So JavaSE, now testable, now light, packaging reduced, and bloat gone. That pretty much addresses a very large chunk of what people would not like about the standards. What you have left over, I would encourage people to view not as oh, JavaEE is like this 7 million page standard that who could possibly ever read that? Well, you don't need to read the whole thing. What you should understand is that really, from the perspective of a vendor, JavaEE is a ton of tests that you have to pass in order for you to ship something to somebody and have them use it. That's really bad for me and good for you. Not really bad for me. Obviously, it's a lot of work to do that stuff, but it makes for better software, and that's what you should view JavaEE as. You should view it as a lot of tests, a whole lot of tests that we have to run, tens of thousands of tests. Okay, so what is TomEE? The name comes from Tomcat plus JavaEE equals TomEE. It's very clever, little concatenation there. We just cut some letters out in the middle. It's pronounced TomEE as in the album or the name or the person. It's not TomEE, it's just TomEE. And then it's web profile certified. The EE7 stuff is in progress. That was just released here in this June or something like that, I believe. And so we have Apache overall working towards that. It's all JavaEE, all Apache components. So we try to use as many of the fellow Apache projects as possible. So of course TomEE, of course Tomcat, but then OpenWebBeans. My faces, OpenJPA, ActiveMQ, list goes on. And the way I like to say TomEE is what we've all in the industry, not us here on the stage, just like everybody, all of you. It's what you've been building for the last 10 years. It's you taking Tomcat and you're adding these things together. So that's what we wanted to build. We didn't want to build something new. As I mentioned, we just really wanted to improve what was being done, what we saw people doing. Despite the fact that a lot of people who build things on top of Tomcat say they're doing it because they don't like JavaEE, what they're really saying is that I want it done this way. So we did it that way. Okay, so here is how to envision. We have a few different distributions of TomEE, and you probably maybe cannot or read that quite so much, but that's on the TomEE website. So we have Tomcat over there on the side. We have TomEE down the middle. That's the web profile version of TomEE. It contains only the web profile technologies. So I'll list them off for you. Basically, we have servlets in JSP. That's covered in Tomcat. We have JTA, the Java Transaction API. JPA, Java Persistence Architecture. CDI, which is the new dependency injection framework that's in JavaEE 6. Who has had the ability to use CDI? All right, who really likes it that's used it? Same hands. All right, so those of you who didn't raise your hand, that's the first thing you should go research after you leave JavaOne is go check out CDI. The reason being is I think that CDI really is a fresh start for JavaEE. I don't want to say the words JavaEE so much because it's a brand that people don't like. CDI is a component model that allows you to do a lot of the things that were really difficult that you couldn't do without, say, like an EJB, but then EJB brings in a bunch of technology and things that, a certain way of doing things that perhaps is antiquated. CDI doesn't come with any baggage. It's a proxy type of technology. It allows for interceptors. My personal favorite part of CDI is the observers. It's a listener API, and it comes with almost no overhead in terms of your complexity to use it. It's one of the most elegant approaches to event handling and listening that I've ever seen, and it makes you want to rewrite all your code in like just a really good way. So I highly recommend checking that out. Java, we have JAS and JAK. Those are sort of JAS is in the JVM already. It's wired up in TomEE. JAK is where @roles allowed comes from, so you can do container managed security. Java Mail and Bean validation and EJB Lite, so minus the heavy stuff, EJB. That's web profile. So then we have basically the same thing with JAXRS. That is basically now the web profile in EE7 and EE6. JAXRS did not make it into the web profile. It is being added in EE7. So we have a distribution of TomEE with that in it. Then TomEE Plus is basically the last remaining things that you possibly would want that are still relevant today that are not in the web profile and towards the full profile. So JMS, the connector architecture, which you probably haven't heard of. I'm giving a little thing about that in EJB 3.2 talk later today. And then JAXRS. So those are the really relevant things that are still being used that we have in the full in what is close to the full profile version of TomEE. Okay, so as I mentioned, all Apache components. And here's what those do, respectively. So OpenWebBeans, OpenJPA, OpenEJB, MyFaces, Bean Validation, CXF, and ActiveMQ we use for CDI, JPA, EJB, JSF, Bean Validation. We use CXF for JAXRS and JAXWS, and JMS is ActiveMQ. And that pretty much covers it. Design goals and just general goals of the project. I would have to say primarily we want to be very simple because that's why we love Tomcat. Obviously, it's very simple. Even though you have to add all these things together, it's still very simple. So if we take that away, it's not very good. We want it to stay simple, and that's not something we do really just because Tomcat does it that way. We, as a project, want to get out of your way and not make work for you. We want to just let you do your work and not create work. So, for example, if you go to deploy a web application that has a reference to a JMS topic or queue, and you didn't create that JMS topic or queue, we don't go, excuse me, sir, you need to make that topic. You know, your topic is called, we can see the name of your topic because it's going to be, say, @resource topic foo. Well, if you don't have one called foo, we'll make one called foo, and we'll log that we made one called foo. We will do everything to make your app deploy and log all the stuff that we're doing so you can see it, but at least then you can go and try your app out immediately, and then when you have time, you can go back and change things if you want. But odds are 80% of what we do is just what you want, and maybe 20% is not. So it's convention over configuration. We do not make you make an upfront investment in configuration just to try your web app. Another one is obviously be Tomcat. So if you've done something to ruin the Tomcat experience in some way, it's no good. Please let us know. If your app works in Tomcat and does not work in TomEE, let us know. We will fix it. We consider it to be a serious bug. So, you know, please, we will be super, super active on that stuff. And then, of course, be certified. We want it to be portable, so that if your app is written on TomEE, you can port that to JBoss or port that to Glassfish or WebSphere, WebLogic, or of course you can do the reverse if you want. If you had a bunch of those servers and you had Tomcat in your environment, you could put all that stuff onto TomEE should you like. Okay, integration. This is sort of one I've been struggling for a way to describe how when you throw jars into a web app, that is not necessarily integration. I'm going to try and show you a picture of how I view it. So here's how I view when people throw jars into a web app, what you end up with. You end up with jars side by side, not talking to each other, not cooperating in your web app. And so you end up having to write all the code to glue them together. And that's that part that's very hard to maintain, and you have to go around looking at blog posts and all that kind of stuff to make this work. Here's how we view integration. So what we do is we need to make sure that if you have a JAXRS component, it has all the @entity context support and all the dependency injection for that. Your JAXRS components should have complete CDI support. Same with serverless should have CDI support. I mean, everybody has to be aware of everything. Integration is not throwing 5 side-by-side things in a box. Like if you took a car and you took it apart and you threw it in your garage and you called that integration, that would not be, you would have a bunch of parts. You could probably put some of them together and get sort of far, but you're not going to get all the way. So we try and put all that stuff in there. And that part is the really, really hard part. When something has to touch everything, that becomes incredibly difficult to do. And these are the things that you end up doing without when you do things yourself on Tomcat. And so this doesn't take a lot of code, it just takes the right code. It takes a considerable amount of work. And here's the rub. So you're building this stuff up to yourself on Tomcat, and then a new specification comes out, and then now you got to go right back in there and figure out how to integrate that into Tomcat yourself. So it never stops. The wheel never stops turning. Okay. So we like to say, spend your time writing applications and not writing app servers. It's the best way to. All right. So what is certification? I'm going to get through this quickly so I can go to the demo. It's months and months of work. This is a huge test suite of tens of thousands of tests that Oracle issues to previously Sun, now Oracle, issues to all the vendors who want to be a JavaEE implementation. So JBoss, Glassfish, WebLogic, WebSphere, they all pass that test suite. And only once they pass that do they release their platforms. And you can better bet that as soon as they're passing it, that platform is going to come out within a month or two of their passing. That is the primary we are ready to release trigger for all these app servers. It's a very significant effort. And like I say, it doesn't make for a bloated, it doesn't have to make for a bloated server. So like when we integrate the stuff together in TomEE, our certified server is about 27 megabytes. And we pass the TCK with the default heap size. We don't increase it. So it's 64 bits or so on a 32-bit VM and twice that on on a 32-bit VM it's smaller, and a 64 is double. So we do our TCK testing in Amazon EC2 using T1 microinstances, the very smallest VM size that's available on EC2. They only have 613 megabytes of memory. We use up the default JVM settings, which are tiny, so you have a couple hundred megabytes left over. We just recently started doing TCK testing on a Raspberry Pi just for fun. I mean, why not? Stefan was telling me just a moment ago that he's building a cool system that does like full screen scoreboard stuff of games, and it's all using little tiny Raspberry Pi, which they're about that big, and it runs JavaEE 8 and TomEE, and he says it's pretty cool. So I can't wait to see more about that. He'll be blogging about it. Okay, so enough talk. All right. So what I'm going to show is Pet Store. Senor Antonio here wrote this fine application, Pet Store, which is a kind of a revival of the one you may have heard about in the J2EE days, but it's more modern and a lot better. In this, if you want to take a picture, because I'm going to show these things. So JPA, bean validation, CDI, JAXRS, EJB, and JSF. These are the kind of highlights of what you're going to see. So I'm not going to be coming back to this slide. So if you're wondering, what was that thing you showed me? Now's your time to remember. All right. I should have a camera too. Just be taking pictures. Okay. And then, because always innovation comes from things that are not standard, here are some amazing things that are in this demo that I'm also going to show, which are not yet standard. Let's call them future potential standards. Arquillian is a wonderful testing framework written by Aslak and Aslak Knudsen, Dan Allen, and some of the JBoss guys. And it's a wonderful testing framework that allows you to write a test and use that against any server. Not just any server, but since I've mentioned we now have a lot of embeddable servers, you can run it in your IDE, all one VM, no remote stuff with an embeddable server, not modify that test, run it against a remote server, not modify that test, run it against a completely different vendor. If you're in the shoes where you have to actually certify your application on a bunch of different app platforms, you have to look into Arquillian. If you don't, it's a significant advantage that you're not leveraging. Even if you don't have that scenario, Arquillian's the best testing framework out there for JavaEE by far. We have a little plugin for running TomEE. We're going to show that. It's a Maven plugin. And I like to show new stuff at JavaOne in big conferences like DevOps. It's, so I hacked this up last week. So when I say last week, I really mean like starting Wednesday. So if it doesn't work, which you probably won't, let's set expectations correctly, it won't work. If it does, that'll be awesome. Okay, so a couple new concepts that some of them have some ideas that we've kind of been working on for a while but weren't fully implemented. So I try to implement those. And another one is a new one which we kind of been thinking about for a while but didn't actually implement. So these are where new specification technologies come from. So perhaps we're looking at some JavaEE 8 stuff. Who knows? It's a group, it's a committee. We'll let the committee decide. All right, so let me first go here. All right, so here is Antonio's pet store. Okay, that's the test area. So it is a database-driven application. We have our entity beans here. I'm going to close all these windows. Okay, is that big enough? Let me see if I pull up some code. Can you see that? That could be bigger. There we go. Okay, so basic entity beans, JPA. I'm assuming most of you use JPA. If not Hibernate, right? Same thing, more or less. Okay, so we have all our domain objects. This is a pet store application, and so at the beginning of the application, where's the DB? Okay. When this application loads, this bean is going to be called. It's a singleton. If you are concerned with, if you're using EJB or considering using EJB, use singletons whenever possible. Do not use stateless. Stateless are pooled beans. If you need a pool, use stateless. If you don't, because you just don't want stateful, don't use stateless. The names are bad. They were named years ago, and we can't change them now. But understand that stateless means limited. It means a fixed number of calls can happen against this bean at a time. It means pooled. If you just simply don't want state, use a singleton. Okay. This thing is annotated with @startup. So when the container boots, when the application starts, this bean is invoked, like the servlet load on startup. But here's the problem with servlet load on startup. You have something exposed to the web now. You did not want that just because you wanted to do some initialization on server startup. You did not want to create something for the world to invoke. So don't use servlets to do your initialization logic anymore. That is not the correct usage of servlets. Only use a servlet that loads in startup if you actually intend to serve requests from it. So use EJB @singleton, and you're great. This is a CDI annotation. I'll mention that briefly later. Here is a nice fun part. This is a new addition in EE6. This allows you to define your data sources and things that you require in your application right there in your application without external configuration. This is everything that I've showed so far here are all things that you cannot get in plain Tomcat. Even something as simple as I want to define a data source via an annotation is not implemented in Tomcat because it's too EE-ish. So their bar for what's icky is probably a lot lower than yours. So here we have two data sources. And now we go ahead and have effectively a couple data access objects being injected via add-inject. This is a CDI annotation. And so as I mentioned, on startup, this method will get called. We have a post construct. And then we have a pre-destroy. And so here in our example, we're going to create our database. And I've reformatted Antonio's code just a bit. So we create a bunch of categories. We add the products. And then we go ahead and persist that down here. If we go ahead and look at that bean, we have a standard sort of entity being EJB that does persistence and that kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and load this up just as is. It's already running. I should have just let it go. All right. So this is now booting and running via the TomEE Maven plugin. So it will download the server. It will download all the WAR files. In fact, you can have just one Maven POM with no actual libraries in it, and that would be enough to provision and start your server, install the web apps that you want, install the libraries into the lib directory that you want, even remove some libraries if you don't want them there. And it's pretty cool. Okay, so we have our pet store, and we have some fish. So we have angelfish, fishbone, goldfish, Fleetwood mackerel. I added some bad names in there because there wasn't enough entries for my taste, and I thought it was funny. We have dogs, of course, so Bulldog, Snoop Dogg, Three Dog Night, iguana, rattlesnake, white snake, you know. I like the caption, Kitty Catan not included. She was the one dancing on the car in the white snake video. For cats, we have, you know, of course, Manx, Persian, Def Leopard, White Lion. Warning, costs an arm and a leg, minus the leg, or minus the arm. Bad joke, yes, of course. We have Amazon, Parrot, Finch, the Eagles, the Yardbirds. If you've not heard of the Yardbirds, you've heard of every guitarist that came out of the Yardbirds. Okay. So, and of course, you know, these are all clickable and yeah, okay. So, very basic data-driven application. Okay, so, oh, I should have left the server started. Here, I'll boot it up again. So there's some REST stuff in there. I had a bug and I fixed it on the other copy. We'll see if I fixed it in this copy. But on the startup, we'll actually print out all the RESTful endpoints so you don't have to go digging through. And we've had this feature for a while, but we actually put a bunch more work into it. So here we go. I'll grab this. So minus all the info lines, if you do like that, boom, you get the, there we go. Now you can't see it at all. All right, well, we show the method names and the actual RESTful URLs, so I'll just highlight get categories, and I'll paste that in there, and then boom, we have our RESTful stuff here. Here's the code for that. Simple JAXRS component. Now, a critical thing to realize about this application, we don't have any third-party libraries, none. These are all using stock technology that's there in JavaEE. So that means that you writing this application would not have had to have gone to find anyone's blog posts, do any integration, write them emails in their comments, get ignored, find somebody else who might have done it, get ignored again, and then work through a bunch of issues, and then eventually have something which perhaps works. And then you leave your job and go to another job, and then they all are screwed at your previous job. So all this comes straight out of the box. Okay, so Arquillian, what you need to write tests. So here we go. You can write some very simple tests with Arquillian. So this will actually deploy this jar file into the server. So we have runs with Arquillian to JUnit annotation. We can get dependency injection in our test case, yay! And then we can actually build up the archive that we want to deploy into the server in the application. So this means if you have a 500 megabyte application with a ton of stuff in it, you can trim it down to just the things that you want to test and do more unit testing than you possibly would do otherwise. So here we're specifying one class end of beans XML, and we're testing one class. Think about the significance of that. You can do JavaEE testing, and I shouldn't put in quotes. Yes, it's JavaEE testing. Testing one class, let's see how that works. So we're just going to run this test. Boom. Not a lot of time. So we're actually starting to leverage functionality in the container, paying very little cost because our app is tiny and does very little. And in fact, the cool thing about this is that it allows you, it's hard to say one of the cool things about this is that it allows you to start mocking things, right? So if you have implementation A and B, you can just say, include the concrete class that I want to test, and he gets his dependency of our database system or our search engine or whatever we have third-party thing, or some other team controls this and we don't want to use that. We just want to mock up one, put that mock class in the application, deploy them together, and then let CDI wire them together, and then now you're testing your logic and then a mocked up version of these other things. So if your organization is this big, mock up those guys, test your stuff, and make your life simpler. Okay. I'll run a bigger test here. This actually does persistence. So this uses EJB, CDI, JPA, and bean validation. And here we go. So there we go, that ran. So I mentioned a lot of things, and it ran still fairly quickly. Who uses bean validation? Okay, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, bean validation is probably the second most important thing to development other than tests. It effectively allows you to test your data, and that's a really critical thing. So in our, let's see if I have it's the item. We have a custom annotation on this JP entity that says price. What does this mean? Okay, so we have an item, it's something we sell, and we have this annotation that says the price cannot be less than $10. And these are all standard annotations that you get to write yourself using the bean validation API. Put them on your entities. The container will automatically run them and check them before allowing you to persist data into the database, so you can get constraints validated before you make the heavy, expensive trip to the database. Why make the heavy, expensive trip only to have the database say, this is not good? So a lot of things that you would want to check about users' data you can do early and standardly and reuse those annotations in all your applications. Okay, so we have a test that shows that. So I've added a little test on here, item price validation. So, yeah.
So if validation rules changes, then you have to repack and redeploy your application. Whereas if you maintain it in the database, is that good practice to maintain the data?
Bean validation has a descriptor file, so you can get a lot of that stuff in XML if you want. And most servers allow you to specify the XML externally. The downside of the database validation things is that if the entities change and the rules change, you're in that kind of situation where every new release you have to then like roll the logic forward in your database as you roll the application forward. This way you can kind of centralize everything. And if you're getting a lot of invalid data from users and you're sending that traffic to the database in a high volume environment, that's a huge cost. Because basically all the people who are sending invalid data are taking just as much back-end resources as the people who are sending valid data. And you can get there's a performance benefit to stopping the bad traffic early. Okay, so here we're creating a category, a product, and a fish. So we have a sickly fish, and this one doesn't look so healthy. Let's sell it cheap. So we're selling it for $5. And then we try and sneak this by the container. And we'll see, of course, the container is going to reject it and say that that's not valid. And again, we haven't had to actually write the code to do the check and admit an error and all that kind of stuff. We just had to annotate our entity itself with the rules that say this can't be below that. How awesome is that? I mean, it just allows you, like I say, write your code, don't write the plumbing. You know, that's a JavaEE thing, and that's a TomEE thing. Okay. So, CDI, we've seen the @inject thing. So, we have this guy logging interceptor. An interceptor is basically an around advice. And here's a real archetypical implementation of an interceptor. When a method is called, this method, it wraps the objects that you want to apply it to. You get to execute logic beforehand. You get to say, now keep going. This is basically filters, servlet filters. If you're comfortable with servlet filters, you get the idea. The cool thing about it is that you annotate the interceptor with your own custom annotation. So this is right here in this application. And then you use that annotation on places where you want to apply the interceptor. So what you can see is pretty much our entire application. It's now our logging for our entire application is handled standardly in one spot. We don't need to spread that over. All right, we're running short, so I'm going to show you some of the interesting stuff, and this is the part that may or may not work. Okay, so if you notice, I'm going to first code this up by hand. So this is the part that's probably definitely not going to work. If you can say probably and definitely in the same sentence, which you can't, but I did. Okay. All right. So here is a little bit of a gripe that I have, and that's not necessarily a gripe, but I see room for improvement, which is where this feature comes from. If you look at this code, it's pretty boilerplate. All right? We have something, we have a find category, and then it goes and validates that you've passed in good data, and then it does find. You have another one, and this one executes an inquiry, takes this param here, and shuffles it into the parameter, and most of this code follows this fairly predictable format. All right, so that's sort of neat, but it's a lot of code, because if we have a lot of entities, we end up with a lot of this boilerplate code. So here's the experimental feature that's not even a week old. The idea is, as I've been mentioning, we want to reduce the amount of work that you have to do as much as possible. So we're going to allow you, invocation handler, to implement the JavaLang reflect invocation handler. Okay? So now you can declare your bean as abstract, have it implement invocation handler, and then go ahead and do something that's implement invoke. And all right. arg0 and then we're going to declare this abstract. Oops, not what I wanted to do. Okay, so now we have a test case with this. Yay, test cases. And fingers crossed, all right, things gonna work for me or not? Yes, okay. So we deleted the body of that. Now obviously, it doesn't make so much sense if you're just replacing one method, but if you improve your little invoke logic so that you can handle all the various kinds of methods, effectively we have only a very few things that we want to do, right? So here is how this looks completely implemented. Here, let's close all this stuff, and that's catalogs. Okay. So what I've done is I wrote a little standard class that's in this application. And when this invoke method's called, I use my own custom annotations that I wrote. These are not standard stuff. They're in the application that says, all right, if they've annotated their method with named query, then I'll invoke the named query logic. And so now I have basically the same boilerplate code that you saw in the other thing, but the logic has been generalized and reduced. And so I have this one little class that handles basically create logic using an entity manager. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab our entity and we're going to call persist on it right here. That's the magical line. We check all our values. I got a read method, find by primary key, which executes entity manager find. Invoke name query, which is another read. We have an update logic here. Does a JPA merge. Of course, still validating the arguments. We have remove. Simply does a merge, then a remove. So we sync it up with the entity manager, and then we delete it. This is all the exact same code we had. But now, look, almost no code in here left anymore. That's the entire entity. That's the entire data access layer. It's all been abstracted out. We have all these so what I'm doing here is instead of having look this. Here was what find category looked like. We are executing, we're saying entity manager get us this query, and we have the name of the query. And then we're setting the parameters, and then we say get me the single result. Well, now I've annotated my parameter with what parameter name I want in my named query. I've set what query I want you to execute, and basically, what else is there? That's enough for you to write the code to do it, and you get sick of writing that code all the time, so why do it? So that's the idea. Allows you to basically take if you find yourself writing the same code over and over and over again and you're falling asleep at the wheel, that's no good. Interestingly enough, this is kind of what home interfaces did. So this is, when we created EJB 3.0, that was my first standard that I participated in. The question I remember coming up very explicitly, should we make an annotation version of home interfaces? And I recall Linda emphatically saying, no, if we have anything resembling a home in there, people will ignore all the stuff that we're doing. And she was completely correct, because if we had done it then, we would have done it incorrectly, like just the way that it had been done in EJB 2.0, right? And so it was a really wise decision. Now I think we could actually do a really cool implementation so you don't have to continuously write all this read, write, update logic that's so boilerplate. It's monotonous and mind-numbing. And the cool thing about it is that unlike home interfaces before, where you had this magical 500-page documentation you had to write, I mean, really all this stuff is driven by code that you could easily write yourself and maintain. And then you don't have to read 500 pages. You just read the one class that you wrote. That's so much easier. Who can't debug? And you can step into it and debug it. I think this is going to be a really cool thing to do. So that's abstract beans, as we call them now. I don't know what we're going to call it because, like I say, it's not very old. Not very old. Another idea that along these sort of lines are, we could have, this sort of driving be standard. So we had to put this little method on the bottom here that to implement invocation handler. We could potentially say, use foo handler. And then we would instantiate that and use that for that method. And you could say how you want the various methods to be handled. And so you could externalize all that logic in perhaps a more flexible way than doing like a big if statement in an invoke method. But whatever. I think the important thing, go ahead.
And we could also use JAXRS, and something like a remove could just also do HTTP delete and stuff like
Perhaps. Yes. I tried to get that to run. I couldn't get that, so I ran out of time. I was like hacking on that until, I don't know, 6 a.m. on Sunday night. So absolutely. Ideally, if you look at the JAXRS endpoint, when I show it to you, I'm going to go over here and show it. Catalog, REST. So if you notice, this thing is all boilerplate too, right? You got a bunch of annotations, and then you have, it's simply calling that catalog service, and we all know already that that method is abstract, so why not make this thing abstract too? And then basically you have JAXRS front end that serves XML or JSON, persisting to a back end, and all you have in the middle, in the Java layer, would be one abstract method. How awesome would that be? Not actually have to write any code. You're just chucking stuff in annotations.
How are you injecting the catalog service if it's abstract?
So what the trick is underneath the covers when we're deploying. So this is a primary example of something you would not be able to do yourself on top of anything, right? This is an example of that we're not just trying to integrate these things together better. We're trying to take advantage of having control of that little piece of that star to drive innovation in areas where it would be difficult. So what we do at deployment time, what I implemented, was when you're deploying the application, we see that EJB is abstract, that it implements an invocation handler interface, and we subclass it using ASM. We generate a subclass. And the subclass method, and we implement every abstract method to just simply call the invocation handler. It's like that much line of code, but it's easy to do because we have the control at the right layer. If you were to try and implement something like that on top of the server, that would be a lot more code. You'd have to have a tool that generated it ahead of time to give it to the server, because the server would otherwise kick out an abstract bean. And so then you're in a situation where now you can't use your standard tooling and all the stuff. You can't just use Eclipse and run it because you need to run this external tool first. So there's a lot that can be done playing at the right layer. Trying at different layers, problems are hard. But yes, that's what we do. We just simply subclass that bean. We swap that class out for the actual bean class, and we deploy that. And then everything just magically works, and all the annotations are supported. Okay, so there is something to show in this particular class. The second concept, which is meta annotations, I've shown this. I showed an EJB specific thing about this last year, but basically, there's a lot of annotations in JavaEE and code in general, and the amount that we're getting is piling up so that there's more annotations than actual code, especially now that we can delete the code. And so it gets sickening, actually. Annotations are a good thing, but we gave up something when we created them. We gave up reuse. So if this was a Java method, and I had copied and pasted that Java method that many times in an application, I should probably get fired. But because it's annotations, We just live with it. We just, all right, that's the way it is. We have to do that. So we take our configuration and we sprinkle it throughout our entire code, and it's completely unmanageable. So I implemented this idea of annotation reuse in CXF just this week. And so here we go. Here's the concept. So this is our enhanced version of the pet store application. So it's very much like CDI stereotypes. What we're doing here is we're making a custom annotation, something of a name of our choosing, whatever we want to call it. We're putting all the methods we want that annotation to have. So if we want this annotation to imply that it consumes application XML and JSON, we put that on this annotation. And then in our code, we delete. We just simply do like that. So now we no longer have to replicate that it consumes this, consumes that, because as your application grows and you end up with a lot of RESTful endpoints, you're going to have XML, JSON everywhere, and then your management comes to you and says, hey, let's just do JSON. And you're like, yeah, that's a big change. And it is, because you would have to go and do a find replace across all of your RESTful endpoints. Well, now, you just do the one. So here, if I delete XML and I hit the service again, let's go over to our extended one. Maven clean install. Forgot TomEE run. TomEE run. That's executing the Maven plugin. It will boot up. All our RESTful endpoints will be deployed. And as we're looking at that, here is the Maven plugin configuration to do that running. Right here. So we say what version of TomEE we want to run. We can give memory settings and the like. We can even pass in system variables. We can say what flavor of TomEE we want, the web profile, the JAXRS, the plus version. What libraries do we want to install in the lib directory? And because this Maven project is a WAR file, it automatically deploys that WAR into TomEE. So we'll unpack TomEE into the target directory, install these libraries, and these are all Maven dependencies, so it downloads them over the internet. It puts them in there so you can get your drivers in there, boots up TomEE, and boom, you can have all your configuration and everything right there in a little Maven project, and it will basically provision a server for you to your specification, and you don't have to do any of this stuff in advance anymore. Okay. So let's go grab our RESTful endpoint here. And while it was XML before, now it's JSON. And we didn't have to do anything but change that one chunk of code. Now all our RESTful endpoints are updated. So let's finish up here. Here's our JavaEE 7 status. If you want to take a picture of this, this is good. Here are the various projects in their states and the versions that are going to apply to them. So most of the projects are in the finishing up stage. ActiveMQ and OpenJPA are in the starting stage or yet to start stage. So it's probably going to be right about here that I think we'll start the TomEE JavaEE 7 branch. because, well, of course, we have to wait for all the dependent projects to get in good states. TomEE has been, in the last year, adopted by a lot of platforms and tools supporting TomEE. So Jelastic, IntelliJ, JRebel, Staccato, New Relic, hopefully LifeArray at one point. And also this week, go ahead and get your picture. You're welcome. Okay, and then also this week we're announcing, of course, we're supporting TomEE directly. So we started a company, TomEE Tribe. We're sharing a booth with Jelastic, and it's basically the TomEE support company. I like to say, TomEE Tribe didn't create TomEE. TomEE created TomEE Tribe. That's the way it should be. So it's a company created by the developers of TomEE. It's us. So if you're enjoying TomEE and you want support, we're there for you. You can stop by our booth. We're giving away Raspberry Pis and an Xbox. We're sharing it with Jelastic, so come over and talk to us. Questions?
So is TomEE drop-in replacement for Tomcat?
Yeah, it can be. So what you would typically, the problems you would encounter are typically that you have too many server libraries in your web app. And so often it's just a matter of taking them out, and then you can go ahead and port it. So absolutely yes, and there may be some work involved because porting is never like free, but yeah, absolutely.
For those annotation extensions, I don't know what you call them, but is that built in, or did you have to modify your app server?
Yeah, well, we're the app server, so yeah, I totally modified the app server itself for that. I haven't checked in all of that code yet. I will. If you want to get updates on it, go to our booth and just get scanned, and I'll send out I've checked in the code. Here are some builds. Go try it out. That kind of stuff, and you can give feedback, and we can work it into the idea. And as I say, this is where the next generation. This is where things that get standardized come from vendors implementing them and trying them out. So we just finished the standardization phase. JavaEE 7 is done, so now is a great time to try things out and make ideas for JavaEE 8.
Is there any plans for, adding just kind of a primitive level of conditional class loading? So, rather than throw everything in Tomcat lib.
Yeah.
Can I just have maybe a Tomcat lib, and I only want this active in certain applications type of thing? Or
Yeah.
does that turn TomEE into more than it intended?
So the question was, is there ever going to be the ability for you to conditionally have things in the class loaders, because sometimes a web app may have those jars and you don't want them to conflict with the server libraries.
Maybe I want JSF.
Right, yeah. So we ship MyFaces by default. What if you wanted to use Mohara? So we do support Mohara, but currently you have to yank MyFaces in order for that to work well. So absolutely. So here's the clever compromise that I've thought of for that. Instead of creating an OSGI-like architecture where the libraries are always there and we try and hide them with the application, why don't we put them in a separate jar name or whatever, and they're not in the server lib directory, and they're not in the server thing. If your web app doesn't have a JS implementation in it, then we'll add that jar virtually to your web app, and then that would be one pragmatic way to solve it. The only thing that would confuse the Eclipse tooling, but that's really the only downside to it. So we would probably just need to update or fix the Eclipse tooling, and it would work fine. And it would allow us to basically do that sort of conditional class loading without having to have a fancy class loader, which is really good because fancy class loaders have severe limitations. They do 95% of the work okay, but when you hit that 5%, that's like a couple weeks of pain that you're looking at. And so doing something simple like just, hey, we're going to add the jar if you didn't have it in your web app is a much more pragmatic approach. Any other questions? Yeah?
What about the IDE integration? Like when you run...
Oh, I should have mentioned explicitly. So all last year I showed a demo that involved Eclipse using the Tomcat web adapter, using a standard TomEE install. If you like, so yes, that works. TomEE works with the Tomcat plugin in Eclipse. You just unpack TomEE and you point the Tomcat plugin at it and it runs. We have a demo on the website. Okay, I got to wrap up, but there's a 10-minute demo as well. You can see the JavaOne talk from last year on YouTube. The DevOps version is my favorite. No offense to JavaOne from last year, but that one's really good. And they all show it working with Eclipse just fine. So thank you very much, guys.